The story you are about to hear is a fascinating detective puzzle that crossed millennia. At its heart lies a single question. Did Jesus of Nazareth really exist? Not whether he was the Son of God, not whether he worked miracles, whether the man, flesh and blood, existed at all. The witnesses and clues are scattered across the ages. From the ancient world, a Roman senator, a Jewish historian, and a persecutor of Christians turned follower. Then there is a fourth man who, unlike the other three, never wrote about Jesus, never mentioned his name, and in all likelihood never even knew he existed. Yet his own life story is key to this whole investigation. From the centuries in between, unknown hands that tampered with crucial evidence. And from our own time, a very provocative book about Jesus from 1975, a second one from 2014, and the modern historians who, after much debate and investigation, reached a consensus that has held ever since. So whether you are wondering how anyone could even doubt that Jesus existed, or you are convinced he was a figment of the early Christians' imagination, stick around till the end. This story holds surprises for both sides. Chapter 1. The Doubts. Is Jesus just a myth? London, 1975. A professor sits down to write the most dangerous book of his career. His name is George Albert Wells, a professor of German literature in London. His first book exploring Christianity came out in 1971. But the book he is writing tonight has much broader implications, and a title as blunt as a hammer. Did Jesus exist? His answer is no. The most famous human being in history, Wells argues, the man whose birth splits our calendar in two, was never a man at all. A myth. The book made noise far beyond the universities. Atheists and rationalists raised it as a banner. Believers were appalled that the question was even in print. Wells's argument goes like this. Read the very earliest Christian writings, the letters of Paul written before the Gospels, and the familiar Jesus is strangely missing. No Galilee, no miracles, no record of his trial before Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor who sentenced him to the cross. The earliest believers, Wells argued, worshipped a shadowy figure from some unspecified past, not a man executed in their own lifetime, and the life story we all know was stitched on generations later. If that is true, the man from Nazareth was not history, he was literature. And beneath his theory sat one hard fact, the silence. Not one sentence about Jesus survives from his own lifetime. Not a letter, not a court record. For a man who supposedly drew crowds by the thousands, the files of history hold nothing at all from those years. Wells had put his finger on a real problem. And Wells was not alone. Over the decades, a loose crowd of skeptics, from popular authors to one credentialed historian, kept adding to the file. Their first exhibit, the writings of Flavius Josephus, the most important Jewish historian of the 1st century, and also a general who survived the Jewish revolt of 66 CE, the failed uprising that left Jerusalem burned to the ground. Although Josephus mentions Jesus in his book, scholars who examined the passage closely found fingerprints on it, a confession of faith that Josephus could never have written, planted into the passage by Christian copyists somewhere across the centuries. The most famous reference to Jesus outside the Bible is, at least in part, a forgery. And then there is the oldest argument of all. Long before Bethlehem, the ancient world was already full of gods and myths that died and returned. A dying and rising savior, the skeptics say, was already an ancient template. Someone, they argue, took an old myth, gave it a name, a hometown, and a life story, and the world came to believe that character had really lived. No records. A forged source. A recycled myth. The question survived the 20th century, and in 2014, it got its heavyweight. Richard Carrier, a doctor of ancient history from Columbia University, published the first peer-reviewed academic book arguing that Jesus began not as a man, but as a celestial being seen in visions, later written into history. Carrier ran the probabilities and concluded the odds were heavily against a real Jesus ever having existed. So, case closed? Not quite, because this case has witnesses, and we have not questioned them yet. Chapter 2. Witness 1. The Roman Senator. Rome. Around the year 116. A senator named Tacitus is writing the history of the emperors, and he has reached the Great Fire of 64 CE, the night most of Rome burned to the ground. He has also reached the rumor that never died, that the Emperor Nero had started it himself. Back then, Nero needed to kill the rumor, so he had found someone to blame. A despised new sect, the Christians. Tacitus, in his own time, is no friend of Christians either. He calls their faith a deadly superstition, And precisely because of that contempt, what he writes next matters. He explains to his Roman readers where this sect came from. Their founder, Christus, was executed under the Emperor Tiberius by the governor of Judea, Pontius Pilate. A specific man, a specific governor, a specific decade. Where did Tacitus get this? He does not say. No Roman court file about Jesus survives. Almost no paperwork from any province does. Maybe older reports. Maybe the Christians his close friend Pliny had been interrogating in those very years. So, on its own, this doesn't prove Jesus existed. But 80 years after the fact, in the capital of the empire, the founder's execution passed as common knowledge. Not one voice in all of antiquity, enemy or friend, is on record claiming this Christus never existed. Chapter 3. Witness 2. The Jewish Historian. Now let's return to the forgery, because it has a second act. Josephus wrote his great history around the year 93, and the famous passage with the forgery is barely a paragraph long. It reads, roughly, "Around this time lived Jesus, a wise man, who did startling deeds and drew many followers. Pilate condemned him to the cross. He was the Messiah, and the tribe of Christians, named after him, has not died out to this day." The obvious suspect in this passage is he was the Messiah, because Josephus was a proud Jew who never converted. When he did hand out the title of prophesied ruler, he gave it to the Emperor Vespasian, the Roman general who had captured him in the war and spared his life after Josephus predicted his rise to the throne. That confession could not have come from his pen. So that much is settled among scholars. But what about the rest of the passage? Maybe the copyists invented all of it. The writing itself answers that. If Christians had invented the whole passage from nothing, it would overflow with devotion. It does not. The backbone is strangely flat, and no believer writes that faintly about his own Savior. But flat and dry is exactly how Josephus writes about everyone. So the flat backbone is his. The shining claim about Jesus being the Messiah is not. And Josephus was not done. 20 chapters later, he records, almost in passing, the trial and execution of a man named James. To say which James, he identifies him the way you'd identify anyone in those days, by his family. James, he writes, the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ. Nobody planted that line. Almost no scholar on earth disputes it. It is a bureaucratic footnote. And bureaucratic footnotes do not get written about the brothers of myths. Chapter 4. Witness 3, the Convert. One more witness, the earliest of all. Go back to around the year 50, about 17 years after Jesus' crucifixion. A Jewish man named Paul is writing letters to the little communities of Jesus followers scattered around the Mediterranean. Paul is one of them now, a Jew convinced that Jesus was the Messiah. He had not started that way. For years he persecuted this very movement, until, he would later say, a vision of Jesus on the road to Damascus turned the hunter into its most relentless missionary. His letters survive. They are the earliest Christian writings we have, the very ones Wells built his case on. 17 years is living memory, the distance between you and the things you personally remember. And in one letter, almost as an aside, Paul mentions a trip to Jerusalem. He stayed 2 weeks with Peter, the movement's leader, and he met one other man. James, he writes, the Lord's brother. Paul is not quoting a legend. He knew the man's brother, had arguments with him, by his own account. You can doubt every miracle Paul believed and every vision he reported, but you cannot be the brother of a myth. Chapter 5. The doubts answered, the objections fall. Let's also revisit the older gods and myths idea and the pattern built on it, that Jesus was simply the newest face of an ancient template. Up close, the lineup falls apart. Take Mithras, one of the templates most often pointed to. He was an old god from Persia, adopted by Rome, worshipped by Roman soldiers in underground temples in the same centuries Christianity was spreading. His legend says he was born from solid rock, but in everything archaeology has recovered about his cult, Mithras never dies, and he never rises from the dead. The supposed template for the resurrection story has neither a death nor a resurrection in it. Richard Carrier, the credentialed historian mentioned earlier, leans on 2 genuinely old myths: Osiris, the Egyptian god of the dead, murdered, cut to pieces and reassembled in stories told for 3,000 years, and Romulus, the legendary founder of Rome itself. But Osiris reigns in the underworld, in mythic time, a once upon a time no one could put a date on. Romulus belongs to a founding legend written down 500 years after it supposedly happened. Jesus, on the other hand, is pinned to a decade, a province, and a named Roman governor. Myths float. This man is anchored in history. And one more figure from that same era settles the argument. His name was Apollonius of Tyana, a wandering holy man from what is now central Turkey, who lived in the same century as Jesus, in the same empire. Listen to what his followers claimed. His birth was announced by a divine being. He healed the sick. He raised a young girl from the dead. And after his death, they said, he appeared to a doubting follower to prove there was life beyond the grave. Sound familiar? We are not asking whether Jesus or Apollonius actually performed miracles. That is not what this investigation is about. Only whether a real man stood behind the story. Apollonius was real, a documented flesh and blood teacher. Nobody argues he was a myth, which means the skeptic's logic runs backwards. Miracle stories are what the first century did to its most unforgettable people. They grew around the real Apollonius within decades. They grew around the real Jesus the same way. The legends are what men like that leave behind. Which leaves the argument that started it all. The silence. And the answer is simple. The silence is completely normal. Almost nobody in the ancient world was written about in real time. Take the earliest surviving accounts of Alexander the Great or the teachings of the Buddha. They were not written down until centuries after these historical figures had died. Paul's letters arrive only 17 years after the crucifixion, which by the standards of ancient history is the blink of an eye. And Bart Ehrman, one of the world's leading scholars of early Christianity, counts Jesus as one of the two best attested Jews of first-century Palestine. The only man better attested is someone you have already met, Josephus, the historian himself. That covers the arguments. But what about the two leading skeptics, Wells and Carrier? Scholars had rejected Wells's answer, but George Wells kept studying for another quarter century. Late in his career, Wells changed his mind. There had been, he conceded, a real Galilean teacher at the root of the earliest sayings about Jesus. And Carrier, the movement's modern heavyweight? By the time his book appeared, the scholarly consensus was already settled. Weigh the evidence, the experts agreed, and a real man stands at the root of the story. So when Carrier published his case in 2014, some wondered whether it might finally shake that ground. It was serious work, peer-reviewed, and the field gave it a serious hearing. But under scrutiny, the theory came apart. The probabilities he had calculated against a real Jesus did not hold. His reading of Paul's letters, the claim that they describe a Jesus who was never on earth at all, did not hold either. Scholars across the field, religious and atheist alike, set it aside, and the consensus held. So how did that consensus reach the rest of us? Through a familiar name and a familiar title. Back in 2012, our now old friend Bart Ehrman had published a book with the exact same title as Wells's bombshell. Did Jesus exist? Word for word. Only this time, the answer was yes. And Ehrman is famous for a reason that matters here. He was a devout believer who lost his faith. Today he describes himself as an agnostic atheist. He has no church to please and no savior to defend, and his books saying so have made him a hero to skeptics. That man sat down and wrote that Jesus certainly existed, and that this is, in his words, the view of virtually every expert on the planet. There was a man. Within decades, real men like Apollonius and Jesus were wrapped in stories where whatever was real became deeply entangled with what was embellished or invented. Over the years, followers kept retelling them. New meanings took hold, and new memories settled in, generation after generation. This didn't necessarily happen out of malice, but because that is the very nature of memory. It recollects fragments and rebuilds them in light of new realities. And that is what made this a real question in the first place. Pile enough legend onto a man, and you can start to wonder whether there was a man at all. So, if you came in certain that Jesus never existed, the majority of historians were never on your side. And if you came in certain that no serious person ever doubted him, the doubt was probably much heavier than you thought, and it was not unjustified. The legend was thick, but the man was under it all along. That's one big idea distilled. Stay curious and come back for more.